true and how much of it's BS, but it usually starts out as something that's happened in my life as a cowgirl and on a ranch and this and that. So I'm going to start out with one called Fence and Pliers. I'm sure a lot of you guys know about this. So this story is not to criticize, to make fun of a cowman's tools, but to only let you know that with fencing, that's the general rule. Although fencing's not a terrible hard job, it's not one the rancher likes the best. It's long, hard, and tedious, and requires much patience. This I will attest. And I will pick up with a box full of barbed wire, the stretchers, the staples, and the dog, of course. A hired man, if you chance to have one, who's supposed to keep track of the source. Now the dog doesn't help, and the hired man's busy trying to light his cigarette. Your patience gets testy, but you realize it's about as good as it's going to get. Except for one day when you decided that he could take the missus along instead. With good help, the job would go much faster. At least that's what you said. So I brought along some coffee and made sandwiches and also some cake. To me, this wasn't the worst job, and I was much better hand than Jake. At least that's what he thought, but something happened that changed his mind. We were walking along the fence pounding staples, him in front and me behind. Well, I was traveling a little faster, and I caught up with hubby there in front. He was reaching in his hind pocket to get some staples. It was quite a hunt. As he bent over to finish the job and pounded this one staple in, something devilish came over me as I spied that hip pocket with a grin. I reached out with my wire pliers and I grabbed onto his hip pocket tight. I clamped down and I twisted and I jerked with all of my might. Well, he danced and he yelled and he hollered and he cussed and things I cannot repeat. I had not only grabbed a hold of his Levi's, I clamped down on some meat. Now, how do you explain a joke such as this when it backfires so very bad? I really tried to explain myself with all the compassion that I had. Well, he never did see the funny side, but he was in quite a bit of pain. I stood there like a kid that had goofed and had better not do it again. He grabbed a hold of his hind end and he danced around with a wild kind of jig. I just stood there holding those pliers. Now my joke didn't seem quite so big. By the time the crisis had passed and most of the pain had finally subsided, the whole subject was dropped immediately because it was so very much divided. The moral of this story is when you're fencing, try to always use good sense. Keep your staples in the bucket and the wire pliers on the fence. Thank you. True story. And I'm divorced now, so I can understand why he was a little upset. Just a little. This one is called Just a Minute, Noah. As I was planning to attend my church, the church bulletin was handed out. The headlines read, Great Flood of 98, God, Noah, Big Boat. That's what it was all about. As a church elder and head of the building committee, it aroused my undivided attention. As I read on further, there were things that seemed too horrendous for me to mention. As in Genesis, God spoke to Noah and told him what a great big flood was planned. And he commanded Noah to build an ark, as there would be no more land. Now the ark had to be big enough to carry 2 of every living, breathing creatures. Right then I began to wonder about the faith and the sanity of our preacher. The sky began to cloud, the rains came, the Lord looked down and he saw Noah weeping. There wasn't no ark. There was no creatures gathered. God thought Noah had been sleeping. God asked Noah why. Noah begged forgiveness, and his story began to unfold. As God was listening to Noah, he realized this story was one that had to be told. Noah had to get a building permit, as his plans didn't meet the standard codes. Also, a sprinkling system had to be installed to water down the load. The neighbors took him to court because of zoning laws and it being built in their backyard. So he had to get a variance from the city planning board. And that was kind of hard. Building wood is was in short supply because of the ban to save the spotted owl. He had to convince the Fish and Game that it was needed to save this species of fowl. The carpenters formed a union. They went on strike. They got so they wouldn't even talk. He gathered animals by twos, but the animal rights group started to squawk. They sued Noah for only gathering 2 species of animals of each kind. He finally got the suit dismissed, but now he was running out of time. The EPA said he could go no further, and environmental impact had to be done on the flood. The Army Corps of Engineers wanted a map of the floodplain. He sent them the globe covered with mud. The IRS seized Noah's assets as he thought Noah was leaving the country for good. The federal government classified the Ark as a yacht, so a luxury tax should be understood. Now, after hearing this, God cleared the sky. The sun shone, the rainbow arched overhead. Does this mean you're not going to destroy the earth? Very humbly, Noah said. After hearing this terrible story, God looked down as Noah continued to sob. No, I have decided not to destroy the earth. The government's already done the job. Thank you. Believe it or not, all those things I think, do happen to people. Maybe not all at once. This one's called Bull in the Bog. I lived in Montana for many, many years, and it was dry. We had windmills, no reservoirs, and I found a bull in the bog, and this is the way this one went. 1997. It was a fall day in October with shadows getting long at best. I decided to check the windmills and began with the one up west. I came upon a reservoir that was nearly dry. Dry summer had dried it up. There was not a dark cloud in the sky. The windmill had worked overtime to keep water for the cows. It was a constant worry as only so much wind we were allowed. I stood there in the open and I looked up to the enormous Montana sky and I prayed for some relief that day that could really satisfy. If you don't now help us, Lord, we're in a world of hurt. That cattle cannot survive this year on old dry grass and dirt. You see, we are only Northside ranchers, Lord. You know what that is like? The elements are against us, including lightning strikes. The range fires that burn the winter pasture, dry grass that's had no rain. Long, cold, snowy winters. This all adds to the rancher's pain. But our love for this wide-open country keeps us striving to succeed. But next year it will be a good one. Now your help we will need. Montana's a good next-year country, most of us ranchers will attest. There's always that glimmer of hope that keeps us going at its best. As down the wow. As down the coulee I drove that day from that windmill pumping site, I came upon a bull in a bog, and boy, he was on the fight. He'd been a 1,300-pound Charolais when he was in his prime, but in his quest for water and his run-down condition is how he ended up in the slime. There he stood up to his sides in a bog that was 3 foot deep. The spirit was there, but the strength was gone. He looked like death asleep. I wandered over to the coulee's edge to ponder this situation. Believe me, the fight was still in that bull. There was no hesitation. He shook his head and he tried to lunge, but he was sucked in there so tight. I knew right then I'd never get him out. He darn sure'd be on the fight. So I drove down to the county road to await a passerby. I didn't know if anyone would come, nor I ever reasoned why. Pretty soon I could see some dust, and I heard a familiar sound. A pickup was coming from the west. I didn't know anyone was around. I blocked the road in desperation to make sure that he would stop. A big black hat on a guy with a chew, and his boots rolled up to the top. He stepped out grinning and said, "Howdy, Ann, how are you doing today?" I said, "Well, I kind of got a problem, and it's up the coulee just a ways." Billy Dutton was a stock inspector and always carried ropes and gear. He was known as a darn good cowhand, so of course I had no fear. So with Bill and his understanding of what the situation was all about, we pondered just what to anchor to when the bull's head was all sticking out. With no other suggestions, Bill flung a loop around the old bull's neck. He tied the other end to the pickup ball. He had everything in check. He tested the rope a time or two to see if there was any give. Even though it would stretch his neck, there was a slim chance he would live. I told Bill I would like to give a shot somehow to that old bull. I'd like to do it fast as soon as Bill had slackened from the pull. He gave the word to stand back just in case the lariat broke. The bull's neck stretched just like a giraffe's. I thought he'd probably croaked. The pickup dug in, the dust flew from the tires as they spun. The terrible sight of the stretching rope, my worries had just begun. All of a sudden, the suction came loose and the bull slid out on the sly. I stood there with that vaccine gun in my hand, and I guessed he'd already died. Bill said, "You better hurry and give him a shot just in case his air comes back." So I walked over calmly to give him the shot. Well, Bill gave him some slack. Well, that old bull started to move. I started to run. Bill jumped in the truck and fled. Did you ever try to outrun a bull, especially when you thought that he was dead? I could feel his breath on my rear end as he hit the rope the second time. The bull flipped over again and again. So in the pickup, I quickly climbed. And we discussed who then would get out and try to turn him loose. This time I called the shots. "Hey there, guy with your big wad of snooze, you get out and take the rope off quick. See if he gives you a thrill. I'll take the pickup and wait for you at top of that big old hill." Anyway, my prayers were answered. We saved the bull from a grisly death that day. And old Bill had a story to tell as he drove on his way. The moral of this story is when you find yourself in kind of a rut, let the other guy fend for himself. And remember, save your own butt. Thank you. True story. I'm glad to do one more. This is called Grady's Night Out. Everybody has a hired man. Some good, some not so good. But they're kind of colorful guys, and they live kind of a colorful life. So this is kind of some of it, well, this is how it went. Grady's Night Out. Grady was a great cowhound. He'd ridden most all of the land on horseback from the time that he was small. He never yearned for wealth, just a good horse and his health. And as far as experience, Grady had done it all. Grady's voice was kind of low, but what most people didn't know, he could yodel with the best of guys. He used to play for dancing and wallered in romances and equip anyone, no matter what size. Grady worked cattle all his life, but he'd never taken a wife. He'd been around, that's what the ladies said. Dressed up in his Saturday shirt, he'd waltz and he'd flirt. He liked those fillies that were dressed up in red. But Grady always went home alone, I guess because he was prone to sipping too much corn liquor on the side. So his energetic zest for living made him plumb unforgiving. Grady said it was really a matter of his pride. So this particular Saturday night, everything seemed just right. Old Grady donned the best duds he could find. He drove by the light of the moon to the Hound Dog Saloon for a night of pleasure and a little peace of mind. He strolled through that swinging door like he'd been there before and slowly ambled up to the bar with ease. The bartender spit out his chew and said, "What can I do for you?" "Well, I'll have a scotch on the rocks, if you please." Grady glanced around a bit. In that room so dimly lit, he could see the people, but he couldn't see their faces. Some wore black leather vests, and he couldn't tell about the rest. They had strange-looking boots closed up with leather laces. Sitting down the bar by chance, a lady's eye caught Grady's glance. She nodded her head and motioned for him to come over and sit down. So he ambled through the dim light toward the lady on the right. He slid into the nearby seat and asked the bartender to pour another round. As his eyes adjusted to that dim light, boy, he could see she was a sight. She weighed around 300 and wore a dress that was pretty low in front. She had wild reddish hair that hung down everywhere, and her butt covered 2 bar stools, and that's putting it pretty blunt. She asked for a royal crown, took 2 beers to chase it down. She slapped old Grady's backside with the palm of her hand. She asked, "What are you doing here?" as she slurped the whiskey and beer. Grady said, "I just came in to have a drink and hear this band." She asked if he could dance. Could he jitterbug by chance? She jerked him off the bar stool and onto the dancing floor. She huffed and she puffed and she giggled. Grady laughed every time she wiggled. They put on a show like no one had ever seen before. The lady sure had too much beer, and what happened next was clear. She dribbled all over the dance floor that night. It came as no surprise. Grady just danced and closed his eyes. She sweat just like a wrestler who'd finished off a fight. Her dress felt like a snakeskin, but old Grady, he just grinned until one of her lungs fell out for all the world to see. I guess she never had a clue, and everyone guessed she never knew how she was entertaining and doing it so conspicuously. Grady then wished he'd never been born. His clothes were tattered and torn. He had a black eye, and his wallet was nowhere to be seen. He vaguely remembers the big biker guy had given him the black eye, and he had on a leather vest and also black leather jeans. A little jealousy must have taken place and got in Grady's face. The redhead turned out to be the big biker's gal. Grady very suddenly changed his plan. As out the door he ran, and he hollered back, "I don't want her, you can have her, pal." On his way back to the ranch, Grady took just one quick glance to see if there was a bike big enough for this gal to ride double. It had to be quite a bike to hold the redhead that he liked, but for Grady, he sure didn't want any more of that kind of trouble. Well, Grady learned his lesson for sure while getting his Saturday night cure. Don't mess around with bikers with their leather clothes and things. And for gosh sakes, don't dare dance with ladies at first glance. Sit right down and wait a while until that fat lady sings. Thank you. Yep, I'm done. That's all I know.